Welcome back to Get Decked EDH with me, Alec. Have you been struggling to protect your board lately? Do you know about protection, but you're just not sure about which scenario each is best in? Well, you came to the right place because today I'm going to cover 7 ways to protect your board pieces and yourself. I'm going to cover how each of these operate, their limitations, pros and cons, and utility uses, and my personal opinions about their effectiveness. Regardless of which skill level you are, you should find something interesting to digest here. So what are our 7 safety blankets? Well, we have Hexproof, Shroud, Phasing, Ward, Protection, Indestructible, and Regenerate. And after I wrap all those up, I'm going to make 4 honorable mentions at the end of the video that I believe should be talked about, but I'm not going to do a deep dive because I feel like they're too specific of strategies and they don't have enough support yet in the current meta. So other than that, let's dig through our list. So some of these are pretty well known, so don't feel bad about wanting to skip over. I'm going to put chapter notes in the description for you to choose which one you'd rather listen to if you want to go over any. So other than that, let's get into Hexproof, which is number 1 on our list. Now this way of protection should be well understood by most who've played Magic before. For the sake of consistency and popularity, we have to cover it. So what is Hexproof? Hexproof is a keyword and static effect that can be applied to any permanent, including ourselves, the player. What does it do though? Hexproof makes it so our permanents can't be the target of spells or abilities our opponents control, but allows us, the controller, to still target said permanent, making it asymmetrical. Some cards specify what it receives hexproof from, like instances or sorceries. Now what limitations do we have with it? Well, if a spell causes a global game action, like say a board wipe to happen, it will still affect our permanent, since the spell didn't contain the word target in its text. So, same goes with edict effects that make us sacrifice creatures. What has hexproof? Well, this effect can be already stable on a permanent or can be given to a permanent through cantrip forms that last until the end of turn for interaction. Okay, now that we've covered the basics, how do I feel about hexproof? It's solid. I obviously use it. I can't think of anyone who doesn't. That's all I have for hexproof. So let's move on to number 2. All right, for number 2 we have Shroud. So let's talk about it. You probably only ever used it with Lightning Greaves. It's nearly identical to hexproof, has almost entirely replaced hexproof, minus a couple of new cards that seem to only include it for flavor reasons rather than practicality. Now what's the difference between Shroud and Hexproof? Well, Shroud not only prevents your opponents from targeting your stuff, but yourself as well. This includes enchantment, auras, and equipped abilities, causing it to be symmetrical. Lightning Greaves sees a ton of play and comes in almost every precon. Shroud is fantastic in decks where you don't target permanents you control often. Otherwise, with cards like Lightning Greaves, you have to do the shuffle method, which requires another creature on the field to transfer the Greaves back and forth, leaving you open to interaction from your opponents. Now, does this ability have any abuse potential? It does. Mono Blue has access to auras that can enchant any creature, giving it Shroud. So for preventative reasons, if you were playing against a Voltron or Cantrip deck, you could essentially enchant an opponent's creature with one of these, preventing that player from targeting their own permanent and potentially shutting down their game plan. Pretty slick, eh? It's important to note for older cards that say can't be the target of spells or abilities, they have received an errata changing that text to Shroud. All in all, I personally think Shroud has lost its place in the current meta. Lightning Greaves kept its seat, but even I personally have stopped slotting in most of my decks in preference to Swiftfoot Boots. What do you guys think? I'd love to know, but anyway, let's finally move on to more interesting and specific protection. All right, for number 3, I want to talk about phasing. Now, I'm not talking about the old keyword phasing, which hasn't been reprinted in a main set since 1997's Weatherlight. I'm talking about selective phasing, like Slip Out the Back or Teferi's Protection, which are both 2 of the most popular protection spells out there. But what is phasing? Phasing is a mechanic that treats an object, whether that be a permanent or player, as if they no longer existed. Sounds crazy good, right? What are the benefits of this? Well, phasing doesn't cause its target to change zones. No exile and no yard. It exists but doesn't. Real philosophical stuff here. Say you have a creature with counters, equipment, or auras on it. If you phase that target out, everything attached to it also phases out with it. When will it come back? On your next untap step, and anything that phased out tapped will phase back in and untap. This is a great way to retain your board state without losing your accumulated value. What's the catch? Well, since the target never changed zones, there's no leave the battlefield triggers on exit and no enter the battlefield triggers when it phases back in. Generally, this is no biggie because there's other types of protection for decks running an ETB/LTB strategy. Also, if you rely on triggers with protected cards, you won't receive them until they're back in reality. But what kind of preventative utility does phasing have? A pretty good one. Remember what I just said about no ETB/LTB? If an opponent has a problematic creature that's causing you harm, you can phase it out. Optimally, you wait until they go through their untap step, and then with cards like Slip Out the Back or Galadriel's Dismissal, you can phase out that problem and they will receive zero benefits beyond it being safe from future removal for a turn. At crunch times, this is extremely powerful. It's important to not do this before their turn or untap step, as it will not prevent the issue. Now, what do I think about phasing? I honestly love it. It's very powerful and useful in the right decks. I enjoy its flexibility with using it defensively and strategically. I hope they continue to print more cards that use it. Although we did get Haystack last year, so I'm a happy camper. Let's phase out phasing and move on to our next item. Number 4 is Ward. First introduced in Strixhaven, Ward in a nutshell is like bringing just enough money to buy a Big Mac, yet we forgot about sales tax and now we can't have that burger unless we pay the extra charge. In order to target a creature with this keyword, you must pay an additional cost, aka Ward cost. Importantly, Ward reacts as a triggered ability, so instead of the creature with Ward being an invalid target like with Hexproof and Shroud, if you aren't able to afford the Ward tax, the spell will be countered and fizzle. So, if you want to be a stickler, you cannot allow takesies backsies when someone inevitably forgets about your Ward. Now, which forms does Ward come in? Well, usually it's additional mana, a common number is 2, yet cards with higher costs have been released more frequently. There's also life payments, usually at 3 life, or sacrifice and discard versions, etc. Obviously, the most backbreaking tends to be the extra mana versions, especially those sitting at 3 and 4. It makes certain creatures nearly untouchable due to players having to essentially pay 5 mana for Swords to Plowshares, which can really slow their game down. Now, creatures can come with Ward and other permanents can give Ward, either to your whole board or singularly through aura equipment methods. It does lack any offensive capability and can be viewed more as a stacks tool for targeted effects. Wipes and global effects get around the cost, so what makes Ward so good? Players hate paying extra for anything. That's why stacks is such an agonizing experience for those receiving the taxes. I personally love using Ward, but I do think some cards have been released with excessive taxes. Boja being a good example of this. Just look at him. Why is he so stacked? Power creep is real. Overall, this is a good way to protect and even creates for more game depth and strategic mana use, if the cost isn't outrageous, of course. Next challenger. Next up, we have Protection. The name Bertha herself. This is one of the OG ways of protecting, having been around since Alpha. Now it has a complicated history and still stands as one of the more confusing keywords, sparking revisions to its description throughout Magic's timeline. So what does Protection do in 2025? For sake of precision and clarity, I will read the current rules verbatim. This object can't be blocked, targeted, dealt, damaged, enchanted, or equipped by anything quality. Mouthful, right? Don't sweat it. I'll break it down. The object can either be a permanent or yourself. The quality refers to a specific identity like colors, players, card types, subtypes, or super types. Mostly you'll be seeing protection from colors out in play. Now, there's a lot of benefits here, but they come with downsides. So for defense and offense, this keyword does both. With cards like Spirit Mantle, that permanent gains protection from creatures, which means whatever you enchant with it can't be blocked, targeted by creatures' abilities or dealt damage, essentially making that creature unblockable. Now, protection from a color works similarly. Any creature with that color or card in general can't affect what you've protected. It's important to note that this doesn't protect against board wipes or global effects unless those cards are dealing damage. Protection from red prevents Blasphemous Act damage. Another negative for protection is if your deck has cards or colors that you've protected a permanent from, because that means it now has protection from those specific colors, kind of like Shroud. So protection is symmetrical. Remember Spirit Mantle? That means if you have an activate ability on a creature, you can't target your enchanted one with it, because protection from creatures includes yours. Now it works best when it provides safety from cards/colors outside of your deck's identity and strategy. Commander's Play is a good example of this. There's also interaction potential with cards like Angelic Intervention, allowing you to temporarily protect something in response to targets. I personally like using several specific protection type cards. Ashiok Champion is one of my favorites, next to Spirit Mantle. In conclusion, this ability requires you to think stuff through a bit more, hence the confusion that surrounds it. So it has a place in my heart, but only in small doses. So we've made it halfway through the video. If you made it this far, I appreciate you sticking around. Do me a huge favor, smash that like button. If you haven't already, please subscribe, and I'd love to hear what your favorite form of protection is in the comments. Other than that, let's get back to our list. Number 6, we have Indestructible. And after that last one, we can take a deep breath of relief. Indestructible is easy peasy and a classic example of protection. So the only thing that this keyword does is prevent your creature or permanent from being destroyed or dealt lethal damage. They still receive the damage, yet it will be removed after each cleanup step. So see you later, board wipes, right? Well, kind of. Whatever has Indestructible can still be targeted and can be exiled or have -1 counters and static effects applied, kind of like Toxic Deluge. If toughness reaches 0, that creature will die. That's Indestructible's huge weakness. With all the ways to exile nowadays, Indestructible has become less popular and attractive. Still very viable, yet one path to exile is all it takes to shatter your dreams. Fortunately, outside of creatures, exile is not as abundant, unless you run into a card like Farewell. Then you can let the tears weep. This keyword can be tacked onto instants as well, green and white providing the support. Tamiyo's Safekeeping and Blacksmith's Skill is a couple examples of this effect, allowing for defensive or offensive interaction. Overall, I still enjoy Indestructible, and even with an exile meta approaching fast, I have the best time saying, oh, it has Indestructible. But let's move on. Last but not least, we have Regenerate. Now, Regenerate is an interesting one and has a history even more complicated than Protection. With current rules, Regenerate is a replacement effect that reads as follows. The next time this permanent would be destroyed this turn, instead it isn't. Instead, tap it. Remove all damage from it and remove it from combat. Seems decent, right? Well, the confusion around Regenerate has something to do with its original rules and placement. Back in the day, there used to be a damage prevention step that came after damage was dealt, allowing players to react to destruction rather than current rules which are more preventative and must happen beforehand. This still allows for interaction and responding to perceived threats, yet with slightly less flexibility. Importantly, damage is prevented with Regenerate, just the destruction aspect. So damage triggers still take place even if a creature has been regenerated. Also, there's plenty of cards that say can't be regenerated. Terminate is a good example of this. Now, even if Regenerate is already active on a creature, can't be regenerated still prevents the replacement effect from happening, meaning your creature will still be destroyed. This also doesn't protect against exile, but does protect against board wipes that destroy. Keep in mind as well that Regenerate will only last until the end of turn, and if the replacement effect has been triggered once, you would need to reapply it a second time in case someone went after your creature again. Overall, Regenerate has definitely fallen off the map, and for good reason. It's a mess, yet on certain cards it still holds its ground and earns its keep. I personally run little of it in my decks, but occasionally I slot it in for convenience of confusion. And then that, my friends, wraps up all 7 of the standard protection types that I had to go over today. Now for my honorable mentions. These ones can be used more specifically in certain strategies, so I didn't necessarily include them in this list, but I do still consider them occasionally protection, but more specifically they are value tools. So let's go with the number 1, which would be Blink. Now, blinking something will remove it from the field and put it into exile, which causes it to re-enter either currently at that time or later at the end step, causing it to be a new object, preventing that target from targeting it. So essentially that spell will fizzle. Now, mostly Blink is used as a value tool. So you can blink your creatures and get more value from their ETB effects. But I did include it as a mention because people do use it defensively in response to interaction. So I just wanted to give a quick brief on that one. And then for number 2, I'm going to talk about not dead yet effects. And these ones are more like cards that if a creature would die, then it would return to the battlefield either at the end step or immediately. This is similar to Blink effects, except instead of going into exile, the creature would go into the yard. And some of these effects also count for exile, but those usually bring it back to your hand. So worth noting because people do this in response to targets. But still, it's not a primary protection piece that can be either static or recurable. So I didn't keep it in the list for that reason. And then number 3, this one is a permanent on the board, and it does give a keyword. It's Umbra Armor. Now, the reason why I didn't include this one is because it is too specific in a strategy and is not common enough for me to include it on the list. Umbra Armor, which was once called Totem Armor but got changed due to cultural reasons, is on enchantment auras, and what happens is, if that creature were to die, you could destroy the Umbra instead, essentially protecting that creature. So it was very slim about me keeping this one on the list, but I decided to put it in the mentions because it was just too quick to go over and I didn't have much else to talk about. There is a card called Umbra Mystic, which does give all your auras Umbra armor, which is pretty cool and neat, and I actually think it's pretty powerful. But other than that, I have my last one, which is shield counters. And now shield counters are a counter that you can apply to a creature. And essentially what this does is if that creature were to be dealt damage or destroyed, prevent that damage and prevent the destruction, but remove a shield counter. Very similar to Umbra Armor, except these can be proliferated. So you can proliferate and get more counters. But the problem with this is that once that creature is destroyed or dealt damage, it can be dealt 1 damage. If it has 4 toughness, it will remove that shield counter. So it's a huge flaw in the system, but it does give you a quick buffer in protecting your creatures. The reason why I did not include it is because there's just not enough support. This got released in New Capenna, and I just haven't seen much of it since to give me enough reason to plug this into the list. Other than that, that's all I have for you guys today. I hope you enjoyed this list. Hope you learned something from it, or at least got a better grasp on how these protections work. Other than that, I'll catch you next time.